The session is about to begin.
Welcome to this session of HLF Online. Today, the founders of the Slightly Foxed podcast, Hazelwood, Gail Perkis, and Stephanie Allen, will be speaking to Usha Raman. The Slightly Foxed podcast is essentially a conversation about books, an audio version of the quarterly literary magazine of the same name, which was founded in 2004. Slightly Foxed introduces its readers to books that are no longer new and fashionable, but have lasting appeal. The founders describe it as more like a well-read friend than a traditional literary review magazine, which I think sums it up beautifully. The Slightly Foxed podcast has 43 episodes to date, with 600,000 all-time listens, and each episode receives more than 4,000 listens within 24 hours. I was introduced to the podcast by Usha Raman and have enjoyed every episode that I've listened to, learning something new each time and adding to my already long to-read list. Episodes have covered the short life and blazing art of Sylvia Plath, the golden age of crime writing, a life in writing with Margaret Drabble, and the shocking story of Charles and Mary Lamb. Let me now introduce the speakers. Hazelwood, founder and co-editor of Slightly Foxed, began her working life on Vogue and has been a reviewer, literary editor, feature writer, ghostwriter, and editor at the publisher John Murray. She has contributed to The Times, The Sunday Times, The Sunday Telegraph, and The Mail on Sunday. Gail Perkis, publisher and co-editor of Slightly Foxed, has enjoyed a long and varied career as an editor for Macmillan, Oxford University Press, and John Murray. She has worked with authors such as Anthony Beevor, Anthony Sampson, James Lees-Mill, Lawrence van der Post, Patrick Lee Fermor, and Devla Murphy. Stephanie Allen, the publicity and marketing manager for Slightly Foxed, began her publishing life at Heffer's Booksellers in Cambridge. She has worked as a publicity manager at John Murray and Persephone Books, and is also publicity consultant for Eland Books. Needless to say, she is a fan of small and vibrant independent publishers. The moderator, Usha Raman, is professor of media studies at the University of Hyderabad and writes for the popular media on topics related to health, education, and gender. Usha is an avid podcast listener and until recently wrote a regular review column for The Hindu called Peace in a Pod. Usha, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarur, for those introductions. Thanks to everybody who's joining us online, and particularly to our guests. I do have to start with a disclosure. This session represents something really special for me. It's a first of a kind for HLF Online. And it features a group who have given me many hours of happy listening. So, it's a motivated session. I really wanted these people to be online with us. Mm-hmm. And it's also the first time that we've hosted a different sort of literary guests, podcasters who are also publishers or publishers who have turned into podcasters. And I can't tell you how excited I am to be meeting the whole team, the Slightly Foxed team. And while I would have much preferred to do it sitting across the table with all of you, a pot of tea, maybe a glass of wine and scones between us, Zoom shall have to do. So welcome to HLF Online, Gail, Hazel, and Stephanie. It's really a delight to have you with us. Maybe, just to introduce what you do and both the magazine, the quarterly, as well as the podcast to our viewers, maybe I can ask you to tell us a little bit about how you started. So maybe before I do that, I should just tell the audience that Slightly Foxed, the podcast, comes out of the Slightly Foxed Quarterly, which is a literary magazine, as Surur explained, with a bit of a difference. It's chatty, it's friendly, it's not your literary criticism scholarship. It is much more like, as again Surur described, it's like having a friend talk to you about books. Just to start off, if I could ask perhaps Hazel to tell us a little bit about how you decided to start the magazine, and then what was your journey into the podcast? And of course, the others can jump in wherever you feel you would like to. Yes?
Yes, well, in in 2004, we all found ourselves, we were all working at a small publisher, or a middle-sized publisher really, called John Murray, very old publisher, family firm, which was then taken over by a much bigger firm. And I think at that moment, we all realized that we didn't really want to work in this environment. So by 2004, we all found ourselves, as it were, out of a job. And we got together to think what we could do. And we debated various things. We debated a bookshop, which seemed a bit ambitious at that point. But we were all words people. And eventually we came up with the idea of a magazine about not the newest books, but publishers' backlists, of which held a fantastic number of amazing titles that one never saw on bookshop shelves anymore. And it was the days of the bookshop supermarket, really, enormous stores. And I think we'd all had the experience of going into one of these enormous stores and being completely unable to sort of make a choice. There was just too much. So as we were getting going, we wondered for quite a while what to call it. I think we were going to call it the Questing Bowl, weren't we? And found that somebody else had taken that title. One of our first contributors came up with the rather brilliant idea of Slightly Foxed, which of course has a sort of double meaning in that, one's feelings on going into one of these enormous bookstores was that you were slightly foxed about what to do. And also Slightly Foxed being a publishing term for slightly browning around the edges of an old book. So anyway, so we got together in Gail's house in what had been her children's playroom and sat round the table and sort of put together our ideas. And we wanted to do something different. We wanted to, we decided that we wanted to be a sort of book of enthusiasms, really, which were about the pleasures of reading, rather than having to exercise one's immediate critical judgment. And it distinguished us from the other book pages, which are, of course, literary criticism. So that was our sort of first thought, that we wanted to produce something that was friendly and kind of enthusiastic, but not uncritical. But we started getting together a list of people we knew who we felt could write. That was another thing we wanted to do. We wanted to have people of all kinds. We didn't want to just have the usual suspects who appear in all the other review pages. And so that's how we started. I don't know whether Gail would like to continue with the story. Would you, Gail?
Well, you've forgotten the money, Hazel.
Well, of course, the money, that was very important.
How can we forget the money?
I'm afraid everything,
Gail did brilliant things there, so I think she should
Well,
tell
we did a business plan. We decided the format of the magazine and how many pages and so forth, and we'd found a craftsman printer up in Yorkshire, but we needed to raise money, and we decided to set up a limited company, and basically sent the business plan out to people saying, would you like to invest? Unfortunately, they did. So we have about 25 shareholders. Everybody's had their money back, and they get a dividend each year, not a very big one. None of us are going to be rich, but we did decide an awful lot of literary magazines start on a sort of wing and a prayer, and the contributors don't get paid, and you're asking favors of people, and we didn't really feel that was sustainable. That to put it on a sort of sound commercial footing was important, that the writers be paid, the artists be paid, and of course, as we began to acquire staff, there were salaries to pay. But I do remember ringing Hazel up and in November 2003 and saying, Hazel, the money's in the bank, so we better crack on with the first issue, which came out in March 2004. And our first print run was 2,500 copies. And the printers in those days had a lovely Yorkshireman called Brian who would drive down from the printing works in Yorkshire down to London and deliver the stock. And he turned up a very early one morning with 2,500 copies of the first issue. And I have to say that I hadn't realized just how much space they take up. I mean, the children's playroom was just full of cardboard boxes. And they gave us a bottle of champagne as to celebrate the first issue. And we spent a whole week stuffing envelopes, sticking on stamps. And I mean, literally, it really was cottage industry at that stage. And, it's grown from that. And now we have a great deal more help one way and another. But it's a funny thing, when you start a magazine, there's all sorts of skills you have to learn, which you never imagined. I mean, getting to grips with things like direct debit and credit cards and databases and the technicalities of printing. I mean, it's been a steep learning curve in some respects.
We did have an extraordinary stroke of luck, didn't we, Gail, at the beginning? I think it was National Book Day, wasn't it? Or
it was, yes.
And suddenly
I got invited to appear on the BBC's main morning news programme. And in those days, because I had children, I didn't really listen to the radio. And they said, we'd like you to come on the Today programme. And I, cheerfully said, yeah, fine, And then we had a girl who was working part-time for us, and she was terribly excited. She said, oh, God, the Today programme. I'd never heard of it. And I suddenly realised what I'd let myself in for. And this was, I think the Chancellor of the Exchequer was on the item before, my item. So I turned up at White City to do this recording. And I left my husband in charge of the phone at home. He very kindly took the day off. And I got back at lunchtime, and poor man was desperate. He said, the phone has literally not stopped ringing. And I haven't even been able to go to the loo. And we just, people just, I don't know, I suppose it caught the imagination. So we started off we had 600 subscribers the first issue. And it's grown by word of mouth and by marketing, ever since, which is where Steph comes in, of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think when we started the company, because we'd all come from the independent world, and that was very much our ethos, and that's what we wanted to continue. We had some really good support from people. We got quite a lot of press coverage, and obviously the Today programme, which is which Gail didn't say, it's the BBC's main news flagship programme. So it was fairly big. And
that's an understatement.
Yes.
Yeah.
We got newspaper coverage and a tremendous amount of support from the book trade press and from independent bookshops, even other publishers. Actually, everyone was really very supportive. I think they were unsure whether it was going to be a success, because if you say, we're going to launch a magazine that is not going to review new books, it's going to review old books. There are going to be no critical reviews, just good reviews.
No advertising.
No advertising. And I think people thought, not quite sure whether they're going to be able to pull this off, but we did.
Mm-hmm.
But the zeitgeist at the time, but at the time, Hazel was talking about supermarket bookshops. I mean, there were the big chains, Waterstones, which was then owned by a corporation, and there was Borders and Books, etc. And independent bookshops were closing every day practically. And in the press, everything was focused on celebrity, the celebrity memoir, the latest big name, the authors who are very good at publicizing themselves, but not necessarily the best writers. And I think we felt quite strongly, not only that there was this enormous backlist to investigate and books to celebrate, which have, clearly lasted the test of time, but also that a lot of rather good books were being published and not being reviewed for one reason or another, and small presses doing very interesting things that again were, not being stopped by the big chains. So I think it was partly a sort of a fight against the corporate world where everything is about money and quality tends to go to the wall, and actually editorial standards. I mean, we Hazel and I have been editors collectively for probably 100 years, I should think, if we add it up. And we really do care passionately that these articles that we produce are as well written as they possibly can be, and we care about typography and design, and feel it's very important that the magazine looks as good as it can, as well as reads as well as it can. So it's printed on lovely cream paper, which is actually made for us by a paper mill, and we have to buy it in 10 tons at a time, which I can tell you is a lot of paper. And we have very, very fine artists on the covers. Every cover has a different artist, and most of them are contemporary artists, not all British, but mostly. And then we have a very wide range of writers writing on, it's not just writing about novels. We do a lot of non-fiction. We do cookery books, we do gardening, natural history. The current issue's got a lovely book called The Life of the Robin, which is the definitive book on the robin, which is a sort of iconic British bird, particularly at Christmas time. But the writers are very, very
novels. Graphic novels too, right?
We've done graphic novels. We've done children's books. The next issue is going to have, the first article is on Asterix, the cartoon strip, the French series of Asterix and Obelix and their dogmatics. But the writers, they're varied, Hazel, aren't they? I mean, we have some very well-known ones. So, Margaret Drabble, for example, or Robert Macfarlane or Michael Holroyd. But we've also had people who aren't actually writers by trade, but who happen to write very well. Wouldn't you say, Hazel?
Yes, I think, and that really was one of our aims, wasn't it? And also, we always say, we're not at all sort of snooty about what books we review, as long as you can make a good case for the book and what it's done for you. And we've had some rather extraordinary reviews, really, haven't we? We had one about an outboard motor manual, which was extremely entertaining.
Seagull engine, yes.
Yes.
That was an example of fine prose.
Very sort of Catholic in our approach. And some of our best writers, as Gail says, are people who do something quite different.
I remember, I think in your very first episode, you talked about, you did mention Asterix, I think, in that episode as well. And then Modesty Blaze.
Yes.
And so on. So, yes, a huge range.
Enid Blyton, Beatrix Potter.
That's true. Yeah. I think there was an episode, I think there was an episode on school stories or boarding school stories, which, I mean, dealt with the entire gamut. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. We haven't talked about the podcast yet. We're still talking about the magazine.
Yes.
But I'm wondering, just in relation to the magazine, do you think one of the reasons it was so well received at the time, despite this huge push towards corporatization of the book trade and so on, was because it didn't threaten contemporary publishing in certain ways, right? I mean, you were looking at a backlist. You were not competing with the shiny new bestsellers.
That's certainly true. Yes, yes. I mean, we're very counterintuitive. Basically, if everybody else is doing one thing, we tend to go and do the opposite. And in the same way that if you're a journalist writing for a newspaper, certainly in this country, you don't get paid until your piece is published. We've always maintained that we like to have a wide range of articles from which to select each issue so that we get the right balance of tone and voice and subject. So we have a policy of, as soon as the article's been accepted for publication and edited, the contributor gets paid. The piece may not appear for a year or even 2 years, but we feel quite strongly that people have put in the work, and therefore they should be paid promptly.
So you're clearly not operating on business principles, because
Oh, very much so. No.
Yeah,
Don't get me wrong.
Really,
We are absolutely run on business principles, but we're run on principles of I don't know whether you've ever read The Water Babies by Charles Kingsley, but in there there's a character called Mrs. Do As You Would Be Done By. So in other words, we treat our contributors and our suppliers in the way that we would like to be treated ourselves. So things get paid promptly, and we're not doing what the supermarkets here do, which is basically use their suppliers as credit, or 90-day payment and that kind of thing. I just don't think it's right.
Yeah, well, I meant that as a compliment, really, because
I take it as a compliment.
Usually
when we treat our we made various promises, didn't we, at the beginning? And one of them was that when you phone Slightly Foxed, you always get a person, and that you're never told that they're in a meeting. And I think as a result, people actually do appreciate, sort of. I mean, the girls in the office are just so wonderful on the phone, and I think that's part of our attraction, really, that you will always be able to connect with us personally, whereas here it tends to be pressing button 1 and then button 2, and
waiting endlessly while you're put on hold.
I think for all the time that is spent on this, it is well worth it, you might say.
Yeah, but do you think, I mean, what strikes me, and this may be a little bit off topic, but the sort of ethos you describe, the values that you say run, underlie the publications and the way you run the business, there's something decidedly feminist about it, right? I mean, you are sort of being counterintuitive in this largely patriarchal, male-dominated industry. So do you think that comes also from being a group of women running this business?
Well, there's no bullshit it that way. I think men are great ones for politics, and
we don't really think of ourselves as feminists, but perhaps we run it in a feminine way.
Maybe female rather than feminist.
Female, sorry, yes.
Okay. So we don't need to get into the politics of that word.
But yes,
we don't spend a lot of time. We don't spend a lot of time in meetings, do we? We don't feel that there's any sort of status attached to being in a meeting, or so things get done quite quickly.
And we don't really have a hierarchy. I mean, I a few years ago, the girls said they wanted business cards, and so I said, well, fine, just put the office details on and your name. Well, we want job titles. And I said, job titles. I said, well, come up with a job title that describes what you actually do, not vice president or, big wheel, but, I said, I'm not having us getting into, sub-editor, main editor, chief editor. It's just, we all know what we do, and we respect what everybody else does. They were a bit put out, but I think they did get the point. And so the business cards simply say, somebody deals with subscriptions, somebody else deals with bookshops. Hazel and I are editors. We're not managing executives or anything like that.
And I think we've all worked in male-dominated publishing houses, where I do remember once turning up for a meeting with one of our editorial assistants, and at the time I was the marketing manager, so I was holding the meeting, and the author there asked me if he could have a cup of tea, and I said, yes, Edward will go and make you one. So I think we avoid all of that, all of the politics and the So
could I ask you then, so 2004 is when you started the magazine, and you ran it for several years before the idea of a podcast came up. And could you tell us how you came up with that? Yeah.
Before we get to the podcast, Usha, we have to tell you about the books, because
yes.
So the magazine started in 2004, and I suppose because we are publishers at heart, sooner or later, I said to Hazel, what about doing some books as well as the magazine? And Hazel has a particular passion for memoirs. So in 2008, we started to produce limited edition memoirs, which are mostly, but not all, reissues of books which have fallen out of print a long time ago. But they're, they're classic slices of life, beautifully written. And I'll ask Hazel to talk about the content a bit more, but they are printed by these same printers in Yorkshire, they are craftsmen printers, and they actually bind all the books by hand. So we reissue these 2,000 copies at a time, and each one is hand numbered. It's copy number 3 of 2,000, with lovely cloth binding and a silk ribbon and head and tail. I mean, they're things of beauty, and they're pocket sized. And we've now done 63 of them, I think. Hazel, why don't you talk a bit about the authors whose books we've reissued, because a lot of them are, wonderful writers.
They are. I mean, there are so many, really. I suppose I can only talk about my favourites, really. But I mean, we get a lot of recommendations from a lot of people, and people often ask us, what is it about a good memoir or a not good memoir? And it is quite hard to put your finger on, but I suppose it's that sort of individual voice that you can tell from just reading perhaps 10 pages. That little slice of life, not a whole biography, but just a bit of somebody's life. And we've done some sort of fascinating. I think my favourite is perhaps it's called A Boy at the Hogarth Press, which it presents itself as the diary of a young person called Richard Kennedy, who went to work for Leonard and Virginia Woolf at the Hogarth Press. And I think he wrote it later in life, actually, but it's presented as his diary at the time. And it is a very, very funny view of Woolf's taken from inside, as it were. But I think that's one of my favourites. We've done some very well-known authors, Graham Greene.
Yeah, I mean, Hilary Mantel's memoir, which of course, in fact, we're just reissuing that as a plain Fox edition. And that's the story of her, or how she became a writer, really, and also overcame, terrific medical challenges. We've done E.H. Shepherd, the illustrator of Wind in the Willows. We've done Ardisoni, Graham Greene, the children's writer Rosemary Sutcliffe, and then there are a few which are not necessarily by people you'd have heard of, but slices of life that, even though they may have been written 70 or 80 years ago, they're still fresh, and they take you into another world, really.
Yes, we have quite a sort of rural section as well, don't we? It's an author called Adrian Bell.
Yes, I remember listening to the podcast where you talked about Adrian Bell. Yes. So I just wonder then about, did you actually scope out the niche, or is it just that this is something you wanted to do and you felt that this was the kind of publishing activity, the sort of literary conversation you wanted to have? Or did you go into any sort of intelligence gathering about this?
No.
Not at all, no.
We just plunged in.
I think also we know a few other publishers who reissue books. Persephone, who you may have heard of, they republish women's literature between the wars, and then Eland republish classics of travel writing. So we wanted to have a specific area of our own, and because of Gail and Hazel's love of biography and memoir, it just seemed natural to do that. It's interesting, in the last 10 years how many other publishers have suddenly started to look at their backlists and say, actually maybe we'll hang on to that, and reissuing titles has become a much bigger part of publishing life now. I like to think that we were sort of there at the beginning.
Yes, and I think actually writing about, most of the book pages now have a section for, some classic. And,
they definitely pinched the idea.
You might have started a bit of a trend there, I don't know, but
but also these books they're objects of beauty, and they're made to last. So many of the books I bought as a student and sort of in the 80s, paperbacks, and you go back to them now and you open them and the pages drop out. They're just so badly made. Our books are hand sewn and made of really good materials, and you know, they, in 100 years time, they will still be readable. I think that's really important. I think if a book is worth taking all the trouble over and all the energy and expense and materials that go into it, then it, you know, it's like building a cheap table or a table that will be still in the family 200 years later. I just think it's important that they're done really well.
But do you think that also is sort of counterintuitive in terms of, you know, the spirit of the age, where everybody is talking about intangible, digital, easily circulated materials, and
Yes,
here
it
you are
is.
talking about these, you know, beautifully produced artifacts. So how does that work in today's marketplace? That idea.
I think there's a bit of a counter movement, actually, in a way, you know, against this sort of totally sort of disposable or intangible world that we live in. And I think people actually are sort of somehow reassured by, you know, the fact that these are sort of lasting things.
Yes, I mean, there was a big movement, wasn't there, when we were starting? It was the beginning of the e-reader, and you know, everybody had a Kindle, and oh, you know, the paper book is going to disappear. And of course, as with all technology, you know, it becomes obsolete in due course. I mean, we've all got piles of videos, and you know, can you play a video anymore? Cassettes, I mean, you know, they've gone out the window, and I dare say the CD will be, you know, replaced at some point.
Already
and I
is.
think that when you're thinking about the amount of, I mean, thinking about our carbon footprint, people forget that all this electronic stuff requires, you know, banks and banks of machines in a desert somewhere, burning electricity. You know.
Yeah, but I also wonder if this is a function of, you know, this generation that has seen both and has a nostalgia for books, for the printed book and the physical book, that they find reassurance in it. And I'm just playing devil's advocate here, right?
No,
so,
I'm sure you're right. But I also think that there is this, I mean, you probably know much more about this issue than I do, but there have been studies, haven't there, on how much you absorb from reading the printed page as opposed to reading a screen. And I certainly know that if I really want to read something, I have to read it in paper form. Otherwise, it just doesn't sink in. I you know, there's a tendency on the screen to sort of skim over stuff. And I think that there is that thing between hand and eye and the page. I mean, it's been around for thousands of years, and you know, there's a reason for that. It works, you know.
It's also, I think, the endorphins in the brain. When you open a book, it's you're relaxing into it. When you open a screen, it's work, and I think the stress levels go up. So I think, you know, there's been a lot in the press recently about people turning away from Kindles and ebook readers and going
stream
back
media,
to an actual book.
Yeah. So, you know, on that note, could I shift tack a little bit and ask you again about the podcast and how that came to be? Because we are just
as long as you let us come back to.
Yes, of course. Please come back to the books.
Well, no, well, yes, because there are more books to talk about. Well, yes, the podcast. Somebody emailed the girls in the office saying that she was a subscriber, and she was also, she and her colleagues were BBC trained journalists who'd set up their own podcast company, and she would love to do a podcast for Slightly Foxed. And so I think it was Anna in the office who passed us this email, and Hazel and I had this hilarious conversation over the phone, both admitting to each other we had no idea what a podcast was. Anyhow, we were swiftly corrected on that, and so we met Philippa Lamb and her producer Lynn Jones, and they've held our hands, because it's quite a different thing to editing an article. I think we were very keen that we should not be the main event on the podcast, where in the same way that we facilitate articles being published, we're facilitating the podcast, but we're certainly not the experts. So we've drawn on, a lot of extremely well-informed people who've written on a very wide range of topics, and the idea is to let them speak and to air their expertise in a sort of accessible way. We don't pretend to know anything like as much as they do about their subject, but we do feel quite strongly that the podcasts need to be really well informed and lots of meat and facts in them, not just airy opinions. We don't want to be talking heads, really. So we when we started, the format has changed a little bit as we learned how they worked. We've made a few adjustments, and last year we were doing them monthly, and that was quite a strain on resources. So they're now quarterly, but they're also longer. We've had a very mixed content, from the fairly highbrow to the really quite lowbrow, but entertaining. Hazel and I always feel slightly embarrassed at how little we know. We've just done one this week on Jean Rhys, and the novelist who came from Dominica in the Caribbean and had a terrible life. 3 marriages, terrible drink problems, terrible rows, terrible poverty, but produced, I think, 5 or 6 astonishing novels and short stories. And the guest on the podcast was Miranda Seymour, who's just written a fantastic biography of her. So, our job was to get the best out of her, to encourage her to talk on the subject that she knew best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I think just as a good editor, really informs herself about whatever it is she's working on, even if the text is not her own. I mean, she makes it her own in a way, right? And I feel like listening to you all on the podcast, I mean, you're really well-informed interlocutors. So your questions are not naive necessarily, right? It's not, so even while you say you don't take center stage, you do a lot of homework to ask the kinds of questions that elicit those responses.
I think a lot of the credit for that should go to Philippa, actually, because she does a terrific amount of homework and she's a very good presenter.
Mm-hmm.
I think when we started the podcast, it's so easy to sort of, a lot of people said to us, oh, you just need to do it yourselves, you just need some microphones and so on. And I think that is, well, it can work, but it can be a rather dreaded approach, And so I think we decided that we did want to do it professionally if we were going to do it at all. Mm-hmm. And that's why we sort of went along with Philippa and Lynn, because they really do know their stuff.
And it's very well edited.
It sort of makes a difference.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, I was going to say it's very well edited. So we actually record up to about an hour and a half for each podcast, and they're longer now. They're about an hour long, but they used to be sort of 45 minutes. So there'd be a lot recorded, and anything that we got wrong, or if we ummed and erred too much, we could cut that out. And sometimes Lynn, so Philippa is our host and then Lynn produces it, she could move bits of content around to give a really good whole of, for the podcast. Yeah. And you're right, though, we do read around the subjects whenever any of us is on. we have a good read of whoever the subject is.
I think one of the lovely things about the podcast has been that Steph has been able to appear on them, because as far as the subscribers are concerned, they don't really know who Steph is, because obviously Hazel and I have our names at the bottom of the editorial. Everybody in the publishing world knows who Steph is because she does the marketing, but it's lovely that she can be talking to the readers. And similarly with the girls in the office, we've several of them have got particular interests or passions, and they've joined in, and it's nice to give them a voice, and a whole younger generation, particularly Anna, who sadly is leaving us soon, but she's been a wonderful asset on the podcast, and is far more in tune with contemporary fiction than we are.
So do you sometimes get new readers for the quarterly and people who go back to your lists, the books that you publish because they've heard the podcast?
We hope so, but very hard to measure. But I mean, it is, I suppose the podcast is, yes, I mean, obviously we'd love to pick up some more subscribers. But it's also nice, it's an additional thing for people who buy the magazine, they've got that on top. So it's, it's all part of the same family. And depending on, whether you want, I mean, obviously the podcasts are free. But if you enjoy them and enjoy the variety, then there's, the magazine is there, and as is the digital back, we've got the whole, if you buy a subscription, you have access to the entire digital archive, which is, oh gosh, it's well over 1,000 articles now. It's really quite substantial.
So do you, I just had a question about the content and, the sort of issues you choose to write about or commission for the quarterly. And I noticed that, I mean, not as a criticism, but just as an observation that there is, of course, a large focus on British or English writers. And I do remember there was one episode of the podcast, and then I went back and looked at the articles which had to do with travel writers. And you talked about a bookstore, I think in Lebanon, was it? And so on. And I'm wondering if you have an idea to produce something around empire literature or, books of the Raj or anything like that. Because this is an Indian show, I just thought I had to ask.
Of course, yes. Well, it's funny you should say that. Last week, I just finished editing an article on the Babu Nama, so the Emperor Babu's memoir. Yes. We don't generally, we choose the subjects of the podcast, but we don't generally choose the subjects for the articles. That comes from the contributors, and as long as they can make a case for what they're doing, we have very Catholic tastes, and we don't have a sort of set vision of, which area of literature, which part of the world we want to focus on. So we've had things on several Japanese classics. We've had things on Egyptian novels, obviously a lot of European novels in translation. And, we're always looking for more of those. I mean, I would hate us to be totally Anglo-centric. But we rely on the writers to have the ideas. So if there's anybody out there who, feels that we're neglecting a particular area, we'd love to hear from them. Yes, so, books on empire, that's an interesting one. Bit of a minefield.
Yeah, because yes, it is a minefield, but I think there's recently there's been a lot of writing that's, taking different sorts of perspectives around that. So
we are hoping to have Anita Anand write for us, because she was actually, we sponsor a biography prize for the Biographers Club, and she was shortlisted for that a couple of years ago, and then she came to speak at our Readers' Day. And obviously she's just recently done a book with William Dalrymple, and she is a fantastic speaker.
Yes.
So we're waiting for a little gap in her calendar to write for us.
Yeah. So do you commission the writing, or is it people just really submit?
They come to us, really.
Okay.
It's how it started. And, occasionally we try and perhaps point somebody towards a book we think they might enjoy writing about. But on the whole, because it is really about people's personal experiences and enthusiasms, we find it works much better if they have the ideas, because those are the books that they're choosing. So in a way, it's a very easy job for us, in the sense that, we're not always looking to match a book and a writer, which is what I remember from working on, the more conventional
commercial publishers
review pages.
But also it means if they've chosen the book to write about, then they're writing from the heart, and I think that's the other thing that distinguishes our articles. Is it, it's very much the heart as much as the head. there's a personal connection there. It's not sort of standing back and judging. And I hope the same is true of the podcast, that it's all about a particular individual's passion for their subject, and a well-informed passion, obviously. But yeah.
And I think that the philosophy that you mentioned earlier on about not doing, talking about books you love, not really talking about books that you didn't like, right? Which is always problematic. So I think that's a good place to start, that writers that you feature in the magazine are people who are writing about what they love. Yeah.
We have had somebody suggest that they write about a really bad book.
And most overrated book or whatever.
Yeah, the most overrated book, and I'm sure that one day that would be quite fun to do. But I think it would have to be somebody who's dead. I think it would be unkind to do it to a living author, and it would also have to be done with quite a lot of humour and skill.
But then, given the fact that you are
sort of,
our
readers are kind of Sorry,
go ahead.
Our readers are sort of on the lookout for a bit of a lift, I think. And
and I think somewhere you had talked about the fact that reading should be treated as pleasure, right? So why should you be writing about things that you haven't enjoyed?
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah. But I just wanted to very briefly ask you about the other members of your team, that is the dogs, right? And you said that you had close to 20 dogs among the...
No, not quite that many, thank goodness.
Okay, was in my head.
So the founder dog is a black and white Cocker Spaniel called Chudley, who is still with us just about. And then I have another one called Stanley, who's he's a red roan, which means he's sort of apricot and white. And then Steph has quite a collection. Well, over the years, you have, Steph, haven't you?
So I've got a mix of rescue dogs. So I've got a Tibetan Spaniel, a Bedlington, and a Bichon Frise cross King Charles Spaniel. So they're all very badly behaved, and they're being locked next door with my husband.
but they do make an appearance on the podcast from time to time.
They do, yes. We have one of the girls in the office, Jess, has a dog of indeterminate breed called Dusty, who comes in and sort of who erupts every time the doorbell goes, and who likes nothing better than chasing a ball around the office. And then Jenny, who ran the office for a long time, who's on maternity leave at the moment, she's got a Whippet and a Whippet cross Irish Wolfhound. I mean, he's huge. So they're all shapes and sizes.
So rather like we should do a podcast episode on literary dogs.
There's plenty of good books about dogs. Yes. What would we do? We'd do J.R. Ackley's wrote a wonderful book called My Dog Tulip.
My Dog Tulip.
I think she was an Alsatian, and she was an appalling, not just badly behaved, but actually bit people. And he, of course, adored her, but couldn't control her. And he wrote a very funny account. And then there's Flush, isn't there? Wasn't it the Browning Virginia Woolf? Yeah. Actually, in The Boy at the Hogarth Press, one of Richard Kennedy's jobs is to walk Leonard Woolf's Cocker Spaniel, who also behaves badly. Now, there's a whole genre there I think we could probably do.
Badly behaved dogs.
Hazel's a cat person, so we mustn't...
I'm afraid you're the odd one out, in the sense that I'm a cat person, I suppose you could say.
But this is exactly the kind of nugget that emerges on the podcast. Badly behaved dogs, favorite drinks, so on and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, when we were setting up the magazine, I have to say that we were known to our family. It was known to our families as slightly sloshed. Quite a lot of wine was drunk.
Quite a lot of wine was consumed.
General stresses and strains.
We do like having parties as well. We any excuse for a celebration. So we had our 10th anniversary party in Samuel Johnson's house in London, and next year is our 20th anniversary and 80th issue, which kind of makes 100.
Congratulations.
So I think we may go back there for a really good party.
And we quite like to launch issues at different independent bookshops. So we've probably talked about that on the podcast as well.
Yeah.
Bookshops that we've visited, we have some real favourites around the country. And just this week we had our winter issue launch at John Sando's bookshop in Chelsea, on the King's Road, and that was wonderful. Great to be back in a bookshop
real
again.
space. Yeah. And I think that's a nice end to the podcasts, right, where you usually do a little either you recommend a tour or a set of bookshops, or I think in the last one it was a wet whistle stop tour of drinking places.
Literary drinking places. Yes, I think
drinking places.
Yes. And we also have our recommended reads section at the end as well, which I think we all quite enjoy. So we just tell everyone what we've been reading and what we can recommend.
Yeah, and I've definitely gone back to some books based on those lists, and recently picked up Picnic at Hanging Rock after I listened to the episode on boarding school books. So yeah, that's really very good. So I see a lot of comments, a few comments and questions in the chat. So I'm not sure if I should just bring them up. So there's one comment in the chat where somebody says, if someone was to make a film on the story of Slightly Foxed, who do you think can play the roles of Hazel, Gail, and Stephanie?
Well, I think Hazel would obviously be Judi Dench, clearly.
Gail would be Helen Mirren.
Thanks.
That name did pop into my head. Yes.
You're going to volunteer somebody for yourself, Steph?
I dread to think.
Yeah, but on a different note, Vijay Kumar asks, how much did your personal equation as editors with celebrity authors help in getting the magazine visibility initially? And you did mention the Today Show, but anything beyond that?
I think one thing that we found incredibly useful was just simply word of mouth. People told each other about the magazine quite quickly, and I think that was it really did sort of yield quite a number of subscribers, I think.
We did have for our 10th anniversary, we did a little publication which was actually to raise money for Great Ormond Street, the specialist children's hospital in London, and it was a tiny little booklet, paperback called Slightly Famous People's Foxes, and we basically wrote to a lot of quite famous people and said, could you draw us a fox? And then we had V.S. Pritchard's son, Oliver Pritchard, wrote a very witty commentary analysing these foxes and what it said about the people. So we had Michael Holroyd did one, Michael Palin did one, Quentin Blake did one, Posey Simmons, the cartoonist. And I think we sold something like 10,000 copies. I mean, I know we gave the hospital, quite a big check for that. But it was very light-hearted, and they didn't seem to mind being described as being slightly famous.
And although we don't have celebrity authors writing for us, we have had a number of celebrity fans. So Michael Palin is a fan of Slightly Foxed and has given us a lovely quote. Hilary Mantel loved our books. Stephen Fry has been a subscriber. So we have a lot of people who follow us.
We've also am I allowed to say this, Steph? We're about to go to.
What are you going to say?
We're about to go to a royal address, which we're very excited about. I can't say more than that, but we do go to a lot of the all the London clubs and a lot of the stately homes of England, and we go to retired librarian living in the middle of nowhere. I mean, we're often asked, do we ever do reader surveys of our subscribers? And the only thing we know about them, other than that they're lovely, is that they love books. They're all ages, all nationalities. We go to 89 different countries around the world. And the sole factor is, they just love good writing. which is really nice.
So I see Surur is here. So Surur might have more questions from the audience. Over to you, Surur.
Yeah, that was, thank you very much for that lovely discussion. I enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed the podcast. I mean, it's really
You're very
conversational.
kind.
I actually had a question as well. Do your podcasts, I don't know the quarterly very well, but do your podcasts relate to the quarterly in some way, or are they completely different? Do they come out of something that you publish in the quarterly?
Sort of, it's more serendipitous than that, I think. But usually the people who appear on the podcasts have had some connection with Slightly Foxed. Either they've contributed, or they've written a book that they're interested in, but I suppose they do. Well, they don't relate directly to the quarterly, do they?
No, but they have the same tone of voice, that same, personal enthusiasm as well as knowledge. Yeah,
but there is
We're
a lot
looking
of
for a literary
serendipity.
enthusiasm.
Sorry, Steph.
No, you carry on.
No, I was just going to say there is a lot of serendipity about Slightly Foxed, in that we don't, I think quite often people, expect us to have systems that we simply don't have. We don't, I mean, the books that come to us as possible reissues are usually just, sent by friends or people who've read the quarterly. We don't, have a system really for doing anything, do we, Gav? Well, we do, but not perhaps of the kind you might expect.
There are some questions from the audience. Sita Reddy says, love Slightly Foxed. I heard, perhaps on the podcast, that one of your models for the paper print design was the small print magazine Hortus.
That's absolutely right. Yes, Hortus is a lovely. It's a magazine about gardening, but it's very much a literary gardening. So it doesn't just review the books that are about how to grow vegetables or prune your roses. It's people writing in a much more intelligent way about gardens. And it was founded by a lovely man called David Wheeler, and it's been going for probably getting on for 30 years. And I used to subscribe to it, and he was incredibly generous. I rang him up and said, I love the look of your magazine. Where do you get it published? So he introduced us to the printer and gave us a lot of very helpful practical advice on postage and packaging and all of that sort of thing. His magazine is quite a bit longer than ours, but he was very generous with his advice and his recommendations. And in fact, there have I think there have been several other magazines since which have sort of copied us. I mean, you never reinvent the wheel on these things. Paper comes in certain sizes and certain quality, and you always have to have signatures come in 16 pages. So there are always there's a limit to how much you can vary things. But to have a good Hortus was a wonderful example, something which was you could stick into your pocket and carry it around, or your handbag. Easy to read, not too long, not too short, nicely spaced. It was a very good model. Yeah.
So Vijay Kumar Tadakamala says, how diverse is the editorial team of the magazine?
In what way?
All women.
Well, that's diversity, right?
Apart from the dogs. Some of the dogs are men, or they were. We don't. We employ people for their talents, not for their background or anything else. So,
but we've all certainly got a mix of backgrounds and come from different areas of the UK, which I think is quite important. Actually, I'm from the Midlands originally. Anna's from Northumberland, and so I think I think that's quite that's quite
actually
important.
we have one she actually is freelance, but she's half Australian and she's half Indian. Her father was a Parsi from Bombay,
right.
but I mean it's to us, it doesn't really matter
Mm.
where people come from. It's, you know, it's whether they can do the job that's important.
I think it's the same with the writers, really, because occasionally we've had someone writing and saying, you know, we don't have enough, you know, female writers or female authors, you know, and, you know, we just sort of feel it's the writing really that matters, you know, regardless of whether they're male, female, or where they come from, really.
Right. Geeta Reddy Anand says, have you identified the subjects or do you slot them? How diverse are the themes you encourage? I think you've responded to that in the podcast. I mean,
there's no limit. There's no limit as long as it's a really well-written piece. We actually had an article last year about a book which I don't think really contains any words at all. It's actually a manual for bell ringing. And it consists of diagrams, which, no, I mean, I'm serious, it does. It's called Diagrams. It's in every church tower, every parish church in England. And it's a bell ringer's manual, and it tells you how to ring the changes. And this woman who wrote about it, she's a very keen bell ringer. And, you know, it was a lovely piece, you know.
I think the difference between the quarterly and the podcast is that, as Gail and Hazel have said, we have authors approach us with a book that they really want to write about. Whereas with the podcast, we do choose the subjects. So we are always looking for something, basically something with a really interesting literary theme or an interesting author, and that's it. So we've done podcasts on specific authors, or we've done podcasts on, we've done one on travel literature, we've done one on literary festivals, on nature writing. So, but we do choose that, and then we try and find the best speakers.
Yeah, I think that's all for this time, and it's been an absolute delight. And I'm a big admirer I love your podcast, so it was really a pleasure to spend this time with you and actually get to see the people behind the.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is like a conversation with friends, and I think that's the best thing there is. So,
well, it's one thing I must say is it's lovely to, you know, India is a very big place, and obviously we have a shared history of which I know has had its difficult moments, but it is lovely that so many Indians read in English, and obviously so many Indians write in English and have made, you know, such a mark in the UK. I mean, you go into any bookshop and there are a lot of Indian authors who, you know, people read and love. And we're very fortunate that we share this language, which is so rich and has produced so much wonderful writing. So thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you all.
Yeah, so I just want to wind up by saying I'd like to thank Hazel, Gail, Stephanie, and Usha on behalf of the Hyderabad Literary Festival. And for the audience, for everybody, join us on the 6th of January 2023 for another HLF online session. Uma Magal and Mahmood Khiyar Khan will talk to Nikhila H. about their documentary, Other Kohinoors, The Rocks of Hyderabad. So from HLF, thanks to all of you, and have a good holiday season. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.